We did speak over email about how not to leave you depressed. So hopefully that will, I'll feel really bad if that happens, so hopefully that won't happen. Our next speaker, see, already trying to be perky, is Lloyd Kramer, Professor of History at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Lloyd has also published extensively on the 18th and 19th century France in a wide variety of topics. His monograph, Lafayette in Two Worlds, Public Cultures and Personal Identities in an Age of Revolutions, which came out with Chapel Hill in '96, won the Gilbert Chénard Prize and shared the Annabelle Jenkins Biography Prize. Lloyd has edited or co-edited books on the evolution of historical thought, historical education in America, Paine and Jefferson on liberty, and more than 24 articles on topics ranging from imperial wars, exile and immigration, and European thought. Lloyd is also the co-author of another major textbook, History of the Modern World, and we now turn to Lloyd.
Well, thank you, Nina. It's a pleasure for me to be part of a discussion about the growing crisis in French historical studies at a conference that shows how lively and full of energy the field really is, even amid all these transitions, and John has eloquently laid out our reasons for despair, and I think we all are facing some of these issues. But when we attend conferences like this, you have to feel optimistic about the vitality of the field. But I'm also reminded of a comment that I read about years ago, made by a member of the French elite before the Revolution of 1830 or 1848. I remember reading somewhere that phrase, "We are dancing on a volcano, but at least we are still dancing." And I read later that this phrase was also used by Gustav Stresemann, the German politician during the Weimar Republic, which is sort of inappropriate on the eve of the American elections. It was also a famous rock song by the Genesis rock band in the 1970s. So, it might be, though, the best way to describe the situation for those of us who work and teach in the humanities and the liberal arts in general, and in history and French history in particular. So with all due deference to Edmund Burke, I'd like to describe my comments as reflections on volcano dancing in French historical studies. And I think it's important to recognize that we're dealing here with an upheaval in the cultural and political context that constantly influence our work, and this volcano will not subside soon. I would agree with John very vehemently that our research and teaching in French history remains essential and valuable work. But now we have to find new ways to revitalize our intellectual dancing in the 21st century. And above all, I want to argue that we need to expand our strategies for engaging diverse public audiences within the university, and even more so outside the university. And in North America, at least, we have to look for new dance partners in new places, and we're going to have to find some new steps. I wish I could dance. Is that part of the thing? We have to find some new steps in order to show why French history should remain on the dance card at American universities and in American public culture. And I would argue that dancing with new partners should not be viewed as dancing with wolves. Another metaphor that we might think about. Okay, so as historians of events like the French Revolution, I think we can identify multiple causes for what we're now calling the crisis in French historical studies. We always look at multi-causal explanations. We obviously work in a political and educational environment that regularly questions the value of the liberal arts and especially of the humanities. The governor of my own state of North Carolina has famously questioned why the state's public universities should be paying for the luxury of disciplines that don't lead to good jobs. And I'm sure my governor is not unique. We also know many parents who steer their children away from the humanities and history, and our enrollments are declining. And interest in Europe is especially declining because students are turning to subjects of global history or Chinese history or outside of history altogether, like economics. And we have to admit the future of the world seems to lie a lot more with China, or India or Indonesia or Brazil than it does with France. So these are the kind of structural transitions that affect student interest in the kinds of courses we teach. It also affects university leaders, as John has pointed out. And this kind of skepticism about France is reinforced by American popular culture. The journalists who write about economics, the journalists who write about global affairs, there is a skepticism about France in general, and this has long been a theme in American popular culture, and especially on the political right. France is dangerous. What do we have to learn from France anyway? So these are the kinds of structural transitions that we're dealing with. I would also argue that we're facing a crisis in our own university training system. I would say we have a problem in graduate education because our model and methods for PhD training in history developed within the framework of scientific research and European positivism at the end of the 19th century. And this paradigm assumed that scientists added small pieces of specific knowledge to explain the reality of the world. And humanists glommed onto this and said, this is what we're doing too. We're adding small pieces of knowledge to explain the reality of evolving human history and human society. And it was assumed that such knowledge had a kind of intrinsic value in the general progressive project of making the world a better place. More knowledge, more reform, more understanding of the social world that we live in. And many of us went to graduate school in a time when this conception of the construction of knowledge was still ascendant. And it's also the kind of view of knowledge that we feel most comfortable with. I admit it, I love finding new pieces of information and debating ideas with people about that information. And it's also the system that still structures our system of professional advancement and career rewards. Even though the world has moved on, we are stuck in that same infrastructure that is increasingly out of touch with reality. So that's the classic model. But over the last 30 years, there's emerged a new argument to justify public education, public universities, and we'll call this the economic argument. The argument that universities are essential for economic development and job training, and the goal is to produce college graduates who can enter immediately into contemporary business enterprises and the high-tech economy. And STEM education is the way to go. It's the way to good jobs. Those of us in the humanities have responded to this situation by arguing that no, actually, in fact, the study of history and other humanistic subjects provides essential skills for economic success. We've all gone down this road. I've given some passionate speeches about this myself. It teaches you how to communicate, how to analyze problems, how to draw connections, how to be analytically astute about cultural diversity. How could we have great businesses without history majors? I've tried that angle. It's gotten me about this far, but it's important. I don't deny that it's important. But I think French history has no obvious claim to significance in this new argument for the practical utility of the liberal arts, because France is not viewed as a center for economic progress or innovation, as a dynamic model for global capitalism. In fact, it's seen as an obstacle, as a lagging area, as a place where you never go to learn about the future of the global economic system. This is a dead end for French history. So, we French historians are working in a political, economic, and cultural context that no longer values the scientific knowledge, the scientific search for knowledge itself, and that stresses or promotes the economic use value of higher education. But there is now a third rationale for university education, and I want to mention that because it goes beyond the scientific model and beyond the economic utility model. And this third model, which was promoted by a former chancellor at my own university, but I'll just put it out there. It's often called the entrepreneurial university. You may have heard of this term. It's buzzing all over the place. but it actually argues that universities are places where people are looking for ways to solve the world's great problems, which go far beyond economics. And these are problems such as climate change, environmental crises, healthcare issues, global immigration, public education, the loss of social community, the complexity of religious conflicts, and many other issues. Far beyond economics, although economics are part of the story. I think this model of problem solving raises a new question for historians. How does our knowledge, teaching, and writing help to solve the world's greatest problems? This is the terrain in which I think we can re-enter the debate, and it's much better for French historians than the framework of immediate economic utility. Because every big problem has major historical precedents, and no problem can be understood without understanding where it came from. So in other words, humanities have as much utility value. I like to use that term, utility. They have as much utility value as the sciences or the business schools or the medical research centers in helping us solve the world's big problems. French history, if we begin our courses, we begin our public presentations by saying, I'm going to help us think about one of the world's great problems. French history offers a path into virtually every great problem. It shows us, for example, this is why we're all such happy people. You got problems? We can help you. The complexities of political violence, the aspirations for democracy, the nature of revolution, the authoritarian threat to democracy, the history of citizenship and immigration, the impact of industrialization on natural environments, the power of nationalism, the social effects of warfare, the practices and ideologies of imperialism, the emergence of post-colonial states, and the interactions between religion and secular governments, and there are many, many others. French history is about all of these issues. So I would argue that we need to use these kinds of big issues to help us rethink the way we train graduate students and the way we teach in the university. We could ask our graduate students to begin their dissertation research by saying, what big problem does your project deal with, and how is your analysis going to help us understand an issue? And we can do this without being presentist. There's a professor at Michigan named Cedar Smith who's recently published a book called Manifesto for the Humanities, Transforming Doctoral Education in Good Enough Times, and I would strongly recommend that people read this. It calls for a new approach to dissertation, setting aside the first monograph model, thinking about shorter projects, exploring other media, exploring a way to communicate through social media or and reaching non-academic audiences. In other words, we need to rethink the whole way we train graduate students in French history. And I think French history can borrow from Cedar Smith's ideas, and I want to note one other example. David Bell just published a book called Shadows of Revolution, Reflections on France, Past and Present. And it's a whole series of book reviews and commentaries published in non-academic journals. And basically what David Bell does is argue that French history is important to you, dear reader, who are not a historian, who cares nothing about France, but you can understand the world you live in through the lens of French history. He introduces all of the new trends in French historical studies in an accessible language in publications, magazines, newspapers, online publications. And I think he provides a model for how we should start training graduate students. Graduate students should be required to write op-ed essays. They should be required to speak to audiences outside the university. They should be taught to explain what they do constantly to people who do nothing like what they do. And as we begin to respond to this situation, I would argue that we can help French historians re-enter the public conversation. It may go against our scholarly grain, but I would argue that it's essential. It's essential for what we want to do, and that we are as essential as the sciences and as the health services for solving the world's great problems. French history has a tradition of the public intellectual. It comes out of the Enlightenment. And I would argue that each of us can become an advocate for the public humanities and become a public intellectual, not necessarily writing for the New York Times, but within our universities, within our towns, within our communities. And therefore, we can draw on the examples of colleagues like David Bell, but many others, who are pushing us to get out of the university and to help us show how French history addresses the world's greatest problems. This will not solve our crisis, but it will keep us in the dance. And it will help future citizens, students, intellectuals, and institutions understand why French history matters. That's my